And now, on to our feature presentation, Longswords and Broadswords, led by Swordsmanship Museum and Academy historian Jerry Berg. While this presentation is pre-recorded, we encourage you to ask questions in the comments, which will be monitored and answered by Jerry. This special presentation is brought to you by the Portage District Library. Thank you and enjoy the presentation.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special presentation of Longswords and Broadswords from the Swordsmanship Museum and Academy, as presented to you by the Portage District Library. This video is dedicated to everyone out there who is still working to enhance their minds and learn new things, even in the midst of this COVID-19 outbreak that we are all living through. This presentation, Longswords and Broadswords, is going to explore the history, the transformation, the use, and construction of various types of European swords from as far back as roughly the start of the Viking Age all the way through the rest of the early modern era to some of the more recent swords and how their change and design impacted the way that they were used. And of course, this presentation is very, very much abridged. As you can see on the table behind me, I have quite a variety of swords. Some of them are replicas, some of them are antiques, and they are just the teeniest bit of the iceberg that is the history of swords and swordsmanship. And so each one of these replicas that we'll be using today, each can and easily would fill their own time slot discussing just that particular one, as well as many of the other varieties of swords across time, and place and space that we simply don't have the time to cover today. So this is a broad scope, talking about some of the general trends that you see in European history, starting from the Viking Age and going on through the modern times. But before we start getting into what swords looked like and how they changed, we first have to answer the very difficult question, what is a sword? And we find that that's an incredibly difficult question to answer, mostly because we're not really sure how to categorize swords overall. Do you categorize swords based on their pommel type? Do you categorize swords based on their blade type, their era, their culture, their country of origin, their design origin, the branch of design transitions that you see across time? We just aren't sure on what the best way to categorize swords would be, and that leads to a difficult question. But I will try to simplify that for us for the sake of this presentation, and I'll be pulling one of my favorite swords out right here that will help me explain what it is that we are learning about. So this sword that I have here is a replica, a very good replica of a late 14th century style of sword that is called a hand and a half sword. And we'll talk about a hand and a half sword later on, but right now I just want to use it because it has a prime example of all of the varieties of traits that you see in weapons that we commonly refer to as swords. So to start off at the bottom, if you will, if you're holding it upright, we're going to start here. This is a pommel. Very frequently, swords have pommels that will act as a counterweight that will keep the weight of the blade focused towards the hands as opposed to towards the cutting part. And that leads to a much more finesse-oriented weapon that leads to a lot of fast and quick techniques, as opposed to weapons like a mace or a club or any other sort of flail or axe that has a weight at the tip, the weight at the damage-causing end. And that changes how they're used and changes how they were created. You also have a grip, fairly common to have a sword with a grip, though they do change quite frequently. We also have swords with crossguards. And the crossguards, or quillions as they're referred to, are there to help defend your hands and allows for the use and implementation of various different techniques as well. And then, of course, we have the blade. The blade would be the actual part that does the damage, unless you're doing some fancy pommel strike techniques, or possibly a mordhau, using the quillions to get through armor. But for the most part, the damage-dealing section of the sword is right here, the blade. Now, swords are different in how they are sharpened. Some of them have only one side of the blade that's sharp. Some of them have both sides that are sharp. Some have what's considered a sharp true edge, and then a false edge, being sharp only at the very tip up here. And it changes based on the culture, it changes based on the sword design, it changes based on the era, and it's really hard to categorize these swords. So we can ask ourselves, how do we categorize swords? Well, okay, swords are weapons that have a pommel weighted at the end, so you can use more finesse techniques, except for the swords that don't have pommels. Well, okay, let's talk about the swords that have quillions here that help protect your hands and add to some defensive aspects to it. Except for the swords that don't have crossguards and don't really protect your hands very well. Okay, well, how about the swords that have two sharp edges that go down the length that help you make a cutting or even a stabbing technique? Except for the swords that don't have two sharp edges and aren't very good at slashing at all. And the list goes on just like that. Asking the question, how do we categorize swords? And there's such a wide variety of them out there that it's hard to really categorize swords altogether. One other thing that I will point out, and through the course of this lesson, I will be pointing out some very common mistakes that you'll frequently see among swords and among more casual sword researchers, for lack of a better term. And I'm going to do one of those clarifications right now with another aspect of sword construction that you'll see on some of the ones that we'll be talking about today. And if you look at this one right here, if you look at the blade, you can see that it has this kind of channel, this kind of groove, if you will, down the center of the blade. Now, why is that there? It's a very good question to ask. I mean, isn't a sword just a sharp weapon that you use to hurt people with? Why would they have this weird channel in here? And there's a very common, though incorrect, answer to that question, and then there is the truth, and a much less widely known answer to that question. And unfortunately, the incorrect answer, which I'll explain to you in a minute, is so widespread that it's almost accepted as truth. And I'm going to work to try to remove that falsehood that's common among sword culture. So let me tell you what the wrong answer is, and I'll actually change exactly how I speak in order to try to represent why this is such a widespread belief. So this right here is called a blood groove. And it's called a blood groove because if you stab someone, their bodies are full of blood and liquids, and it creates a vacuum if you stab it into them. So you try to pull and tug your sword out, and it just gets stuck in the vacuum that is their body. Unless you have this, a blood groove. And the blood groove allows the blood from their body to break the vacuum, thus allowing you to pull your sword from your victim and use it again to strike another foe. Nope. That is intense. And usually a lot of these kind of epic or battle-oriented explanations for swords are actually less truthful than we might want them to be. So let me tell you the actual truth, the actual story behind what this groove is. And I'm going to level with you now, it's not as intense as that last explanation, but it's truthful and it's logical. This groove right here is called a fuller, and it acts as a stabilizing trait of the construction of this sword, which is especially useful for the hand and a half sword, which wants to be a long blade but also light enough to use in one hand, because it removes the excess weight that would be in the middle of this thick center section of the blade, but it also allows for rigidity of the blade, and I can try to put some force into this blade and it's not going to bend very easily, which is assisted in part because of the design of the fuller, this kind of groove in the middle of it. And it acts like an I-beam in construction, where you have a large chunk of metal or steel, but it doesn't have the excess weight of being a simple bar. It has, or a simple square-shaped stock. It has an I shape, which keeps the shape and the rigidity and the strength of that piece of metal without adding the unnecessary cost of having the resources in there, or the unnecessary weight of having a straight, complete square-shaped piece of metal. So, keep an eye out if you're out there researching swords, and I'll probably promote a little bit of those through the rest of this presentation as well, about commonly believed incorrect facts about swords. with that, let's start. Let's go back. I'm going to put this down. We'll probably return to it in a little bit. But we are going to start at an early part of European history, or really the High Middle Ages, with the Viking Age. And we are going to grab this sword right here. Now, this sword is a replica, fairly well made, though it might be a little short for an appropriate Viking sword. But this is a type of sword, a style of sword that's very common in the Viking Age, frequently called Viking swords, or more appropriately, probably better called a Viking Age sword. This style of sword here was actually very common throughout most of Europe during the High Middle Ages and the migration period, and even dating back to Rome and sometimes even Greece. But this overall design of sword has very unique characteristics to it. Firstly, we want to point out that it does have a very beautiful pommel. The Vikings were known for the artwork that they had in their metalworking and their woodworking, especially in their weapon design, which also doubled as a sign of social status or wealth. But the one thing that I really want you to pay attention to is the crossguards. Now, this is pretty unusual. I mean, I'm going to grab this sword, and the usual belief is that you have these crossguards on your blade to protect your hands as you're sword fighting. But this is really not going to protect my hands very much at all. Even just a little movement of an opponent's sword is really going to take my hand off or cause some serious damage to the tendons there. Why is that? Well, this style of sword with the long, thin blade and the very short crossguards is pretty common in European history, even dating fairly far back, and it's known as a spatha. And a spatha type sword is exactly this, a long blade, very short crossguards. Now, why? Why is this sword designed the way it is? There's a very simple answer to that question. And it's very common in all cultures, all warriors during the Viking Age. And that is that this is not the weapon. This is one half of a two-part weapon system. And the other half of that weapon system is a shield. Or in case of a Viking shield, a shield. Viking shields had a center grip under a metal pommel, or a metal boss, as it's called, to protect your hand. And roughly 32 inches in diameter, made out of planks of wood. And frequently, as you are using your Viking shield in one hand and your spatha in the other, they work in tandem. They work so that you can maximize your fighting efficiency with shield and sword. Now, why is that? What does that have to do with the design of the spatha? Well, the answer being, with the spatha and its intentionally short crossguards, you are able to work your way around the edge of that shield, minimizing the opening that your opponents would have, and also minimizing the risk that you might get your crossguards caught on the edge of that shield. Because if you did that, you're essentially stuck without a weapon and sacrificing a lot of your range that you would have in this combat that you would be engaged in the Viking Age. So, the spatha was the iconic weapon of the Viking Age, and its unusually small crossguards are actually intentionally made, working in tandem with a shield. And you see that with the Romans as well. The gladius had intentionally small crossguards, and it was meant to be used in conjunction with the Roman scutum, or tower shield. So you can see sword design is not intentionally made by fighting by itself, but usually works in tandem with another weapon. Before we continue, I do have one other weapon to talk about during the Viking Age. And just like with the Viking Age sword that we showed before, this one is also decorated. This sword, or essentially long knife, is called a langsax. It goes by many other words, scram sax, war sax. A sax, as it is essentially a Viking Age side knife. It was a knife that you would have on your person for various reasons. You could use it to carve wood, you would use it to cut your food, you would use it to cut rope. In case of emergencies, it was just something, a blade that you would have on your person in case you needed it. But as the Viking Age continued, and as the constant threat or constant use of Viking raids happened, and Europe became much more militant or much more on edge, you start getting military versions of this. And that would be the langsax, this version of this knife that is essentially a sword, just a larger version of a knife, made intentionally for war. I'm not going to be using this guy to start shoveling food in my mouth or cutting up my, using delicate movements to carve wood. This is intended for war. And you see this kind of side knife growing into a more militant version across many cultures and many eras. The iconic one would be the Bowie knife. You also see the Spanish Navaja. And there's the Renaissance German Bauernwehr. Then all of these had a militant version of it. And you frequently see a more casual weapon for day-to-day life growing into a more militant version of itself as countries or time becomes more warlike. So moving out of the Viking Age, Europe was going through a huge transitional period at this point. Countries were being unified into, or small tribes or small kingdoms were being unified into larger regions, larger countries, larger kingdoms. Communication and unification was the name of the game for post-Viking Age and late Viking Age Europe. And with that, you also have an odd transition. So this is the next most common general design of sword that we see in Europe. This particular one is made in Ireland, and we'll cover that in a little bit. But the general design is that this has the long straight blade of the spatha, but it includes these much larger crossguards here to help protect your hand. I mean, if you compare the two, you can see that my hands are much better protected with this arming sword, or knightly sword, or cruciform sword, as it's frequently called, compared to this small spatha. This became common for a number of different reasons, but the one that I want to bring to your attention is because you start getting more soldiers in your armies. You start getting armies during wartime, or sometimes standing armies, very rarely at this point though, but the army size is getting larger. And with that, you have to draw not necessarily from your warrior class or your elite fighters or your mercenaries, but you have to start drawing from the poor folk, the peasants, the serfs, the lower classes that are more numerous. And with that, you can't arm every single one of those soldiers with a shield and a full set of armor that's expensive. And so one of the theories as to why this cruciform sword with the larger crossguards developed was to allow for additional protection for soldiers that were just expendable, if you will. It also allowed for some really neat designs. So this particular sword, like I mentioned before, is actually based on the design from 16th century Ireland, where you see the iconic ring pommel here. You also see the quatrefoil designs here on the quillion, and then also this kind of wider, almost fin-like crossguard on the blade, which is more iconic to Ireland. But you do have other types of swords that have standard crossguards, standard disc pommels, as well as just a more generic sword that varied based on region and era as we go on. One new development appeared that you really don't see earlier, especially not in the Viking Age, no thanks to video games and movies that like to say otherwise, but you start seeing swords such as this one appear. And what this is a longsword. And you start seeing longswords, meaning swords that you would want to wield with two hands in order to gain certain advantages that we'll talk about in a minute. You don't see that in the Viking Age. You don't see that with the Romans. You don't see that until roughly the the early 1300s with these great swords of war, as they were called, and then eventually developing into the longsword. So with this, I'm going to dispel another myth. According to movies and video games and TV shows and popular books, etc., these swords obviously were much larger than the one-handed swords and therefore weighed much more. So according to the popular media, these long swords, the only ways that you can fight with them effectively is to use these huge, sweeping, heavy, slow cuts. But that's not the case at all. Because, first of all, they're not very heavy, and we're going to talk about that later on when we get to the even larger swords. but they're actually designed to use the human body and the simple machines that we can create easily from it to an advantage. So, for example, if I were to pick up the arming sword and I were to make a cut, yes, I can make a fairly fast cut with it, but I'm limited to how fast my body can move. I'm limited to how fast I can move my shoulder, how fast I can move my elbow, how fast I can move my wrist. I'm limited by the human body. But with the longsword, I have an advantage because I have 2 pivot points. Very simply put, with a longsword, I can push with my upper hand, pull with my lower hand, and make a cut faster than any one-handed sword could possibly hope to make, because I have that machinery, because the design of this longsword with the extended hilt and the longer blade allows me to maximize how my body moves to create maximum damage or technique with the longsword. And in fact, the longsword is one of the more popular types of weapons that you see historical books about martial arts and how to use these weapons appear. As early as the 1300s, you see these books, these surviving documents, manuals, codexes about how to properly use these techniques appear, especially in Germany. You also see Italy and England and many other countries start to take up this concept of writing down and recording how to properly use a weapon like this. During the Viking Age, the migration period, a late Roman era, you don't see too much, relatively, of a variety of swords. You see a few changes. We talked about the Spatha, we talked about the Langsax, there's a few other varieties that become popular. But in the 16th century, the 1500s, you see such a wide variety of weapons appear. Starting even earlier in the 1400s, but really concreting themselves into different categories in the 1500s. Different cultures had brought different things to the table, different regions and different uses. The changes of war led to different niches that different types of weapons could fill. One thing that you start seeing is, I'm going to bring back this one, hand and a half swords. And this hand and a half sword has lots of different designs for different uses. First of all, it's light enough that I could easily use it in one hand to do one-handed fighting techniques. But if the situation called for it, I could put 2 hands on it because it has a longer grip and a longer blade that's incredibly light, and I could use this weapon like a short longsword. It becomes the all-around utility weapon that you could see lots of different soldiers on the battlefields holding. Myself personally, as a martial artist, some people might think, wow, this is very cool. You could use it one-handed if you need to. You could use it two-handed if you need to. It can do anything. And myself, in my experience, I think, yes, it can do anything, but it doesn't do anything very well. So to talk about other varieties of weapons that appear, we're going to start jumping into different cultures. One of the cultures is actually fairly popular in the modern day. And some of you at home might recognize this. This is a type of sword that comes out of Scotland. And Scotland was really making a culture of itself in this era. This type of sword represents that, and it is called a claymore. A claymore, the name of this sword coming from the Celtic or Gaelic word cléadamál, which I'm horribly mispronouncing, I'm sure, but means big sword. And this is a big sword. This is a Scottish two-handed longsword. And to show off the differences in how you can tell it's Scottish longsword, European longsword. This is much bigger. In fact, the claymore has different varieties of itself. This one represents a longsword version, but there's also a greatsword version going up to as tall as 6 feet and represents the type of intimidation that a Scottish soldier, a Scottish Highlander, a Scottish Gallowglass mercenary might have and bring to the battlefield. There are some ways that you can identify this as a Scottish weapon and other weapons as a Scottish weapon, or at least a Celtic weapon. And that would be with the quatrefoil designs on the end there. You saw this earlier when we looked at the Irish sword. but also the forward-angled crossguards are very iconic of Scottish weapons. And these weapons would be used by different Scottish clansmen in their different smaller battles, smaller skirmishes, when compared to the larger battles that were happening in mainland Europe. Scotland was stuck in clan warfare, which included a lot of intimidation. And nothing is more intimidating than a big Scotsman carrying a big sword and using it to great effect for fear tactics. One of the ways that soldiers possibly used great swords, and while this is just a long sword, we'll talk about great swords more detailed in a minute, but one of the ways that they would use it would be area denial. And that would be taking these big swords, and while you're not intentionally trying to hit anyone or kill anyone, you're simply making these huge sweeping cuts, which I'm very limited in my ability to do in this small space here. But you would use these huge sweeping cuts on the battlefield, constantly using the weight of the sword to keep the momentum going, and using that as scare tactics. You're essentially turning yourself into a moving blender on the battlefield, and if your enemy is trying to gain ground or trying to chase down your allied retreating troops, and you're there with, a small number of your friends distantly spaced apart, but all of you doing the spinning and cutting and flow techniques of these great swords, the enemy is going to think twice about trying to make their way through you and taking you down, thus giving your allies a chance to recuperate, to rethink their situation, to retreat, and possibly saving some lives. Great swords in general were the special forces, essentially. They were the special weapons that had specific tasks to be used on the battlefield. Speaking of different great swords, we're also going to use this to jump to another culture that was incredibly militant at the time, and that would be Germany. So, let me explain a little bit about that. Germany had a class of soldiers that was incredibly common, that came out of the Holy Roman Empire, later to be Germany in the modern day in that region, that were called the Landsknecht. And the Landsknecht were the pioneers of modern military concepts. Instead of the less organized and more individual-focused and brutal-focused, such as the clan warfare of Scotland, the German Landsknecht really made finesse, organization, and marching as a unit and fighting as a unit a fine art. And they would use pikes, which are 16 to 24 feet tall spears, essentially, in formation, working together with your soldier pals, your compatriots, in a unit, following the commands of a leader, and all fighting together. If a well-drilled pike square or pike wall worked together, they would create this impenetrable wall of spikes. And that led to a huge revolution on the battlefield. The concept of the medieval knight had to be completely scrapped and brought brand new, because a knight, a fully armored knight, incredibly expensive, would be easily taken out by a group of well-drilled, essentially lower-class people armed with these pikes. The concept of the knight being the wrecking ball on the battlefield is no longer relevant, because these pikes took out that concept. That was not a viable military option anymore. And that was thanks, in part, to the Landsknecht, who perfected this type of working information. So they had a variety of weapons, some of them unique to Landsknecht, some of them just adopted by them. One of their unique weapons was this, the COTS Bolger, another development of the arming sword. And the COTS Bolger was the iconic Landsknecht blade. And the Landsknechts used these not exclusively as an icon of their involvement or their status as a Landsknecht. This was, to clarify, if you were a Landsknecht, you would have a COTS Bolger with the iconic figure 8 style crossguard, and you would carry it around so everyone knew that you were a proud Landsknecht, and they would stay out of your way. But in addition, we now have a new type of warfare with pikes, pike and shot, as it would later be called, but for the most part, at least in the early 1500s, pike warfare. And while you are very good against cavalry, if you have a pike formation, what do you do against other infantry who also have pikes? Now, one of the answers to that was just send your own pikemen against them. And you get these lines of pikemen coming together and frequently not doing very well against one another because their pikes would get tangled up and create this knot of wood. And as the armies would push and push, the pikes would get higher and higher, thus rendering them useless and initiating something called bad war. And bad war is when all that marching information, all that rigidity that the German Landsknechts tried to create and perfect went out the window. And so instead of now pushing your pikes all together with your unit to try to stab your enemy, it's now a crazy mad mess. And that's when the COTS Bolger really came out, because you have very close combat, much closer than a pike could even hope to help with. And you would have these COTS Bolgers right at your side, ready to do these small, quick cuts and stabs, and very hefty, not just in the blade, but also in this figure 8 crossguard, which adds a lot of protection to your hand. Now, the Landsknecht didn't just have the COTS Bolger as their weapon. They also had this. This is a great sword. And this particular one, modern term Zweihander, or the more period terms would be Biedenhander or Schlapperschwert, or battle sword, or two-hander, is their version of a greatsword. And just like the Scots and the Claymore, this would be used for intimidation, just like that area denial, swinging around on the battlefield, preventing your opponents from gaining land and gaining advantage against you. But the Landsknecht also used these in another way, and that would be against pike walls. So instead of resorting to having your infantry attack your enemy infantry and just going into that bad war, the Landsknecht would send out specially trained soldiers called Doppelsoldners to go charge the enemy pike wall and basically weaken it. Now, this was incredibly dangerous, and while the Doppelsoldner were paid twice as much, that's how they got their name, double soldier, Doppelsoldner, they get paid twice as much. The old adage is they get paid twice as much to live half as long. So they were the special forces of the Landsknecht armies, and they would frequently go out there, and while it's commonly believed that they would chop the heads off of the enemy pikes, that's pretty frequently been disproven, but very likely they would simply use the weight of these swords to push the pikes out and create an opening. Perhaps I'd have myself pushing that way or like that, and have another Doppelsoldner pushing that way, creating a large opening for a third Doppelsoldner, a fourth, a fifth, a 12th, to go in and just wreak havoc on the enemy pike formation before our allied pikemen get here to mop up. And with that leads to another very common misconception about swords, and that is the weight of these swords. I personally have heard at various events, wow, how did they swing these swords? Well, let me tell you, it wasn't easy. These swords weighed up to 40 pounds, and you could only swing from below because it was impossible to lift a sword up that weighed so much to create a downward strike. Nope, not true at all. In fact, this sword, this replica right here, is maybe 3, maybe 4 pounds. A full-length greatsword that would be 6 feet would be roughly 6 to 7 pounds. And the largest swords, which are called parade swords, which were created not for battle, but specifically because the German emperor, such as Maximilian, loved parading his military through the nations of the Holy Roman Empire to show off his might. And he would create these intentionally large swords, completely useless on the battlefield, but just large to show off to the crowds how powerful his military was. Those ones that were intentionally created large and ludicrous rarely exceeded 15 pounds. In fact, frequently were much less than that. And so this idea, this concept that a sword weighs a ludicrously heavy amount doesn't make any sense. This is a slashing weapon. Even the heaviest of them are a slashing weapon. They are not crushing. They are not creating weight. They are creating flow and movement. And the concept of a 40-foot sword, aside from being laughable when you consider the concept that the very rough rule of thumb is 1 pound per foot of sword, if you consider a 40-foot long sword, that's hilarious. But in addition to that, it just is completely useless when you consider how a sword is actually used. So keep that in mind. Swords very rarely weighed more than 7 pounds if they were actually intended to be used in battle. at least in Europe. There were some larger swords in the East that also were used in battle, but they had a different story completely in and of themselves. So, Bapelsoldner, great sword. Not very heavy, despite the fact that it's some of the largest swords ever used in combat. Now, the Germans also had another type of weapon. And this leads to a good question, especially talking back about what really is a sword. And it started with this. Late 14th century, popular in the late 1400s, popular in the 1500s type of sword called a Messer. And those of you who speak German might recognize that word. It translates to knife. And that's essentially what this is, a big knife. And you can see the iconic knife design, where instead of having the standard thin tang ending in a pommel of a normal sword, this is a full tang, meaning you can see it's a flat piece of metal that has two slats of wood on the side, put together kind of like the kitchen knives that we have in today's day and age. Now, this was fairly common. It was especially common among the lower class. We're not really sure why. We're not really sure why it was created differently. Different theories exist. One of the common ones is that it was simply the knife makers guild trying to worm their way into the sword makers guild territory, but we don't have a clear record of it. But what's important to the talk about sword development is that it had this right here. It's essentially a third crossguard. You have your standard one facing you and facing your opponent, and then this third one protecting your hand. It was referred to as a nagel, which translates to nail, just a little piece of metal that eventually developed and got more and more complex, spreading out over the hand. Keep that in mind because we're going to talk about another sword and they're going to fuse together. So bear with me. The next sword that I wanted to talk about was this one. Now, this is iconic. This was very common in Spain, Italy, the southern European areas. While this particular sword was another development of the earlier arming or cruciform sword, you can still see that standard cruciform shape here. This one started getting more and more complex, just like the Messer that we just talked about. This particular example has a few forward-facing extensions off the crossguards, sometimes allowing, or possibly allowing the combatant to keep his index finger up front, allowing for a much straighter or longer-reaching thrust, as well as a knuckle bow here in this kind of D-shaped protection for the hand. Now, this particular example would be an early rapier, sometimes called a side sword, Espada al lado. And then it would, of course, develop into the more iconic swept hilt that we all picture when we picture the Three Musketeers, or Zorro. And that would be, though some Zorros were sabers, and we'll get to sabers later on. I want to put that little caveat in there for any Zorro fans watching right now. Nonetheless, these concepts of not really a development in the blade, but a development in the protection of the hand, fuse together to create this. This is a very early type of weapon, Dussac, sometimes a similar type of weapon known as a Sinclair saber, really becomes the first broadsword, a basket-hilted broadsword that we see growing popular later in the 1700s and 1800s. But this one comes from the late 1500s into the 1600s, a Dussac, Tessac, Dusage, has various names in it. And you can see that it has a basket hilt. So the nagel of the Messer, combined with the more complex hilt of the side sword and the rapier, fused together to create this incredibly protective hand protection, the shield, essentially. And when we look back for roughly 600 years earlier, where the Spatha, with almost no hand protection, unless you count the shield as hand protection, which some might, compared to 600 years later with the basket-hilted Dussac, you have this complete 360 with hand protection over a relatively short period in European history. A neat side note, and then also the popularity of the Dussac, which we know is popular even in civilian cultures because we have so many surviving combat manuals. I mentioned them during the longsword section earlier, but these books, these Fechtbooks, survive even today. And there are many historical martial art practitioners who study these books and try to recreate combat with the longsword, with the rapier, with the dussock, like this. But the thing that was fascinating about the dussock is you start seeing a trend in weapons, and that would be a curved blade. Now, there were curved blades before. In Europe, they weren't as popular as they were getting in the next few centuries that we're going to be talking about now. But the dussock and the popularity of it really helped kickstart the curved blade. This idea fused with the Polish sabre, or sabla, of the 1500s to create a brand new trend that we see when we compare two late 1500s trends, which are the dussock, a heavy curved blade, and what we mentioned earlier, the rapier becoming a long, thin, stabbing-oriented blade. And that becomes the trend that we see in the 17 and 1800s. And that's where we're going to continue right now. We're going to jump forward in time. And with that, we're also going to start talking about some of the artifacts that we have here. Now, if we have some artifacts from the 1500s, but we really don't want to touch those too often, but we do have some artifacts from the 1700s that we can handle, and that's where we're referring to right now. So, coming out of the 1500s and the 1600s, you see this trend of split of swordsmanship, if you will, between the thicker, smaller, cutting-oriented blades and the thinner, longer, stabbing-oriented blades, which would be the dussock and the rapier. And out of that, you get the saber, or broadsword, and the small sword. We're going to talk about small sword first. What we have here is a prime example of a mid-1700s small sword. And this is original. This is from the century, from the 1700s. And you can see a few iconic designs of it. One, this is obviously a sword for stabbing. Not just from your perspective, where you can see a long, thin blade, but when we get into the details of it, you can actually see that it in no way could cut. And so we're going to look at this, and from your perspective right now, you can see, oh, it looks like a sword blade, right? It has the fuller down the middle, it's very thin, but I'm going to twist it a little bit. Wait a minute, what's that ridge there? What does that mean? And what you can see is this blade is not your standard flat blade with two edges, but it's actually a triangular blade. It has a triangular cross section. So if we were to cut this blade right here and look down it, it would have a triangular shape. These are not sharp. These could not be sharpened. It would ruin the integrity of this incredibly small and delicate blade. This blade is the complete far end of the spectrum towards cutting and away, or towards stabbing and away from cutting. This is a blade that can only stab. And with it, you see these fancy designs, stabbing forward, lunging in different ways, to create a very unique fighting style that actually we still have today with Olympic fencing. Has its origins with the popularity of the small sword. And this is, for popularity's sake, this is a type of sword you might see on the hip of a pirate captain, someone who would see himself as a wealthy person. An aristocrat or a philosophe would have a small, dainty, and very complex and beautiful blade, such as this small sword. Whereas their counterpart, their lower class counterpart, might have something like this, a cutlass, which has various different names at this time: cutlass, hanger, cutto, hunting sword, saber. They are all referring to the opposite of a small sword, a broadsword. So while a small sword is made for stabbing, a cutlass is made for cutting. And while, yes, it can still stab, and frequently it will, the design of this blade, the curved shape of it, allows for easier cuts. And the reason for that is if you were to cut someone, one of the many reasons, to clarify that, is that if you were to cut someone with a straight sword, and you were to just simply lay that blade upon them, it wouldn't do much damage to them. You would have to do a pull or a push cut to actually cut into the flesh of the opponent that you're trying to hit. Whereas a curved blade, among various reasons of why it became popular, allowed for an easier slash. So you don't have to push or pull the curve naturally allows that cut and really emphasizes it when this blade contacts flesh or something that you would wish to cut with it, which is incredibly fascinating. Now, another unique thing about this is that we keep talking about those combat manuals. Well, there's plenty of combat manuals throughout the late 1600s and 1700s on the small sword. Throughout the entire century, more than 100 years, plenty of manuals came out explaining how to fight with it. This, we don't see any until the very end of the 1700s. And that would be indicative of another trend where the curved blade became popular with the lower classes, the illiterate folks, those who might not have the wealth or money to spend free times learning how to sword fight, but instead would just need something quick and heavy to get the job done amidst a lot of the other labor that they would have to go through, such as a naval person having to clean the ship and haul cargo, as well as have something quick and dirty to get the job done. But as cavalry started to come back into popularity, you start seeing the saber become popular. And I'm going to grab another one here. Well, this is an infantry curved blade, and this one dates from roughly 1767. It's a variant on a type of sword that was popular in that year, or a model that came out in that year. We then have as opposed to the infantry saber before, we now have a cavalry saber. And this is a model 1822 French cavalry saber. And it was a sword designed for fighting on horseback. And let me show a quick example of it. Though these blades were probably about 80 years apart in history, roughly, you can see the length is quite different. While this would be the smaller, the cutlass we just looked at would be used for fighting afoot, this longer, heavier blade would be used for fighting on horseback. And with it, you start seeing a change in how these swords were used. Instead of the earlier medieval style where you'd pull the arm back and twist your body and unleash a very strong and core-oriented cut, the Victorian Age started seeing a different type of combat where your hand is protected with a nice triple bar swept hilt in front of you. You start seeing more molinettes, these spinnings from the wrist happening. And so with that, the type of combat that you see changes from a more body-oriented to a more posture-oriented fighting style with the small sword and the broadsword. And a broadsword represents lots of different things. A broadsword can represent a cavalry saber. It basically represents anything that's not a small sword, but it can represent a cavalry saber. It can represent a basket-hilted broadsword. It can represent anything that is allowed to cut. And this one right here, probably from the late 1800s, represents a unique trend that you start seeing. Swords are now not just military items. They are also something used by civilians. And they're especially popular in the late 1800s when the Western world was going through a popular phase of athleticism. So you have this. You also have another example here. These are practice swords, and you can tell that they're practice swords by a number of different reasons. One would be looking at the tip. These two blades have rounded tips. They are not going to puncture anyone's flesh. They're barely going to puncture clothing. And if someone is wearing a heavier type of jacket, such as a fencing jacket, this isn't going to go through them at all. So these are types of weapons. Oh, and another reason that we can tell is because we can actually see in the items that we have. For example, we have paper advertisements that are selling practice swords along with fencing foils and single sticks that are used specifically for athletics or swordsmanship practice rather than killing, rather than military. So what's unique about this and these types of swords is that these, commonly referred to as gymnasium sabers, are just that. They are a type of gym equipment. As in, you could go to the late 1800s version of Planet Fitness and pick a sword off the wall and find another partner and start having a sword fight with him to practice your technique, to practice your health, to make sure that you are fighting fit. Which is phenomenal, and I wish we would bring it back into the gymnasiums of today. And so this broadsword culture was actually very popular, so much so that the Olympics in the early 1900s included broadsword fencing alongside with small sword fencing, or as we know it today, Olympic fencing. The unique thing about these sabers is that while I don't subscribe to this, and a lot of historians don't, there's a very common practice where people like to explain the development of swords as a series of obstacles to overcome. Well, so with the Spatha, well, they realized they needed to protect their hands more, so they increased the cross guards. And then they realized they got cut in the hand, so they added a knuckle bow. And then they realized they wanted to find a way to attack an opponent from farther away, and so they lengthened the blade and got a rapier. And then they realized they wanted to cut more, so they curved it and made a saber. There is no logical explanation for how swords developed. It just basically the answer was tradition and what was popular at the time. But nonetheless, if you do subscribe to that idea of the evolution of swords being a direct development of obstacles to overcome, the saber was the most technologically advanced weapon in human history. Because it is so modern. In fact, there was even cavalry charges in World War II that included sabers as a legitimate form of combat amid a world of machine guns and artillery and missiles and nuclear explosions. The sword was still there, and even today, while the sword is no longer in a combat-centric role, it is still a part of the military. And the history of swords is still going forward. There are still researchers trying to recreate swordsmanship. Olympic sport fencing is becoming incredibly popular. Countries around the world are even legitimizing lightsaber combat as a national sport. And so swordsmanship is still alive and well and is progressing just as much as it was 200, 300, 400 years ago. And with that, swords are a huge representation of human history. Swords have always been hand in hand with human culture, human history, human differences, bringing people together, separating people, but they are always there, and they are a prime way to get yourselves interested in the larger concepts of human history, and the larger differences and similarities, understanding of different cultures. A sword is a prime example of how you yourself can get interested in something that you might not be interested in before. And that really is the goal of this Swordsmanship Museum and Academy, to use this natural interest in swords and swordsmanship and how they're used and why they were used and why would someone want to get so close to an enemy. Why wouldn't they be scared? Why were they trusting themselves to this weapon? That natural interest is a perfect vehicle to get into the larger concepts of human history and human culture, using this tool that is still such an integral part to human society and who we are as a culture today. Thank you all very much. That concludes our presentation on longswords and broadswords. If you are interested, please comment on this video. We will be monitoring it for quite some time, so if you have questions, please leave them here and hopefully we'll be able to respond to them very quickly. Please follow, share, like the Swordsmanship Museum and Academy, and of course, a special thank you to the Portage District Library for hosting this presentation. Please, everyone, stay safe and stay healthy and keep your minds active. Thank you. Take care.